If you've ever gone into a home improvement store, you've probably seen a statue of St. Francis of Assisi in the lawn and garden section. He's the one who has birds perched on his shoulders and squirrels gathered at his feet. And that's because in the Roman Catholic Church, he's remembered as the patron saint of animals. And as you see in this picture here, on one side he has a lamb, on the other side he has a wolf. And that's probably because there's a legend that a wolf was attacking his village, killing chickens and pestering people. And one day, when St. Francis encountered this wolf, he began to preach the gospel to him and told him to repent of his sins and his wickedness. And according to this legend, the wolf stopped bothering that community, and instead he became this beloved animal who everyone really cared about, and it was essentially this domesticated pet that followed St. Francis around from that point forward. St. Francis is remembered for a lot of things, but maybe one of the things that goes unnoticed is his invention of the nativity scene. Now, you and I, we might take for granted that the nativity scene was ever invented because we've seen them really all of our lives. But it wasn't until the 13th century when St. Francis went on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land and he witnessed the inconveniences of Christ's birth, and he was so moved by this experience that he wanted to bring it back to Italy to recreate it for the people who lived there so that they too could be moved by this visualization. And so the first nativity consisted of an ox, a donkey, and a manger. As far as I know, there was no replica of the Christ child. It was just an empty manger, and it was all in a cave, because for the first few centuries of Christianity, Christians believed that Jesus was born in a cave. And according to St. Francis's admirers, he was so moved as he stood in front of the manger preaching that he could not even utter the name Jesus. Instead, he referred to the Christ child as the babe of Bethlehem. Now, when we think about St. Francis's original nativity scene, it seems fairly simple. It actually includes more detail, though, than we find in the New Testament. Neither Matthew nor Luke mention any animals being present there. The reason that St. Francis probably had a donkey and an ox is based upon a verse that he found in Isaiah 1:3. Probably also because he's the patron saint of animals, and he wanted to have animals everywhere. But neither Matthew nor Luke mention animals being present. The only thing that we have mentioned is a manger, of course, which is where animals would eat and drink. Modern nativities also include the entire Holy Family, Mary and Joseph and Jesus, shepherds, magi, or the wise men, angels, and a host of different animals. We have a hymn in our hymnal called The Friendly Beasts, and it mentions all kinds of different animals that were present there. And that's all really kind of just based upon tradition and how that evolved over a long period of time. And then, of course, the family and all of these different figures are situated in a stable, and somewhere in the background there's a Star of Bethlehem. And this is the nativity scene that you and I are most familiar with, the ones that we find on the church altar and the coffee tables in our living room. And I think the reason that St. Francis's depiction of Jesus' birth is so much simpler than the one that we have now, our modern nativity, it's because he bases it exclusively on the Gospel of Luke. And all of these other elements come to us by combining the stories in Matthew and Luke. And perhaps this simple depiction of Jesus' birth reminds us that the gospel narratives were intended to be read as separate accounts. They were intended to be read independently of one another, rather than forced into one single narrative. And in addition to these nativity scenes, we see it every time that we go to church during the season of Advent and watch a Christmas pageant, with shepherds and magi walking down the aisle one by one, going to visit the newborn king. And I realize that these are just honest and innocent depictions of children coming to worship the Christ child. And so I'm not trying to be critical. I'm just pointing out something that we need to think about maybe and look a little more closely. That when we try to force these stories into one account, we actually suffocate the unique theological contributions that each of the evangelists bring. We sacrifice the signs and the symbols that are at the heart of the story. And I think one of the biggest obstacles that we face as we try to encounter these stories as modern readers is the assumption that Matthew and Luke are offering objective historical accounts about Jesus' birth. Although the birth narratives contain some historical information, their primary purpose is to convey a deeper message that goes really beneath the surface. When we compare the birth stories in Matthew and Luke, there are certainly similarities. For instance, both Gospels claim that there was a supernatural conception. Both Matthew and Luke claim that Jesus' parents are Mary and Joseph, and that Jesus descended from the line of David. Both Matthew and Luke claim that there are angelic appearances. In the Gospel of Matthew, the angel appears to Joseph multiple times in a dream, both preparing him and warning him. In the Gospel of Luke, Gabriel appears to Mary. And last but not least, in both Matthew and Luke, Jesus is born in Bethlehem of Judea. But when we begin to compare the similarities and the differences, it becomes clear that the differences certainly outweigh what Matthew and Luke have in common, and it's important to pay attention to their unique portraits. In the Gospel according to Luke, the focus is really on Mary. Matthew's focus is on Joseph, so we have a great portrait of Jesus' birth in the New Testament. In the Gospel of Luke, the angel appears to Mary, a maiden who lives in Nazareth. And based upon what we know from that time period, Mary is probably somewhere between 11 and 13 years old. This was the age that young women were given away in marriage. And so she and Joseph were already engaged. Now let me give a brief explanation of how engagement works, because it's an important element of this story. Engagement was a legally binding contract that was just as important as marriage. There was a very fine line between engagement and marriage in the ancient world. Of course, because she was a female, Mary was considered a piece of property. She belonged to her father. And when it came time for her engagement, her soon-to-be fiancé, Joseph, would bring a dowry to Mary's father. And this would transfer Mary as a piece of property from her husband, or from her father to her future husband. That's kind of difficult for our modern sensibilities. But from that point forward, Mary would be the responsibility of Joseph, even though she would continue to live with her parents for approximately another year. The nature of engagement during that time period was that a man and a woman, really to adolescents, would make vows in the presence of 2 or 3 witnesses. It became a legally binding contract. And so if there was unfaithfulness, it would be considered adultery, not just cheating or infidelity. It was adultery. If one of them died, then Mary would be considered a widow and Joseph would be considered a widower. And if they decided to break off their engagement, it wouldn't just be a breakup, it would be a divorce. They would need to go before another group of witnesses and completely nullify the vows that they had made. And so engagement was a serious thing. And Mary and Joseph were somewhere in that 1 year period of engagement when an angel appears to Mary and tells her that the Holy Spirit will come upon her and that she will conceive this child. And of course, in the ancient world, they didn't have an understanding, a modern understanding of biology and human reproduction, but they knew enough to know how a baby was made. And Mary was confused. She couldn't figure out how this could be possible. But the angel explains exactly how God is going to make all of this happen. And in response to this, Mary leaves. She just retreats and goes to the Judean hill country. And a lot of details are missing. No conversation with Joseph really at this point. She just leaves. And this is probably a 60-mile journey. It would have taken Mary multiple days, probably somewhere between 3 and 5 days, to make this journey on foot. And she goes to the home of her cousin, her elderly cousin, Elizabeth. And it seems pretty clear that Elizabeth and her husband Zachariah are supposed to remind us of the patriarch and matriarch Abraham and Sarah, because they're elderly and they can't conceive a child. And when Mary arrives, she learns the news that Elizabeth has also conceived. This it's not a virgin conception, but it is certainly a supernatural conception that John is on his way. And the Gospel of Luke tells us that Mary remained there with her cousin for about 3 months, and then she returned to Galilee. There's no conversation recorded here with Joseph. We find that in the Gospel of Matthew. All we know is that Mary and Joseph then returned to Judea. Another 60 to 80-mile journey. They returned to Joseph's hometown of Bethlehem for Joseph to complete the census so that he could pay his taxes. And there are a lot of traditions, really late traditions, that creep into the way that we remember this story. For instance, if we look at the Gospel of Luke, there's no mention of Mary riding on a donkey. But if you watch a Christmas movie or get a Christmas card, you're probably going to see Mary riding on a donkey. And this tradition comes much later, centuries later, from a document called the Proto-Evangelium of James. This is an early Catholic document, and it was invented centuries later to explain what the Roman Catholic Church calls the perpetual virginity of Mary. And in this account, in the Proto-Evangelium of James, Mary is led on a donkey by James, Joseph's son. Because according to the Proto-Evangelium of James, Joseph was a widower. And the purpose of the story is to explain how Jesus had siblings, because they wanted to preserve this idea of the perpetual virginity of Mary. But of course, when we read the Gospels, we get the impression that Mary and Joseph had a completely normal marriage, and that they consummated their marriage after Jesus was born, and that James and Joseph and Simon and the sisters that are mentioned in the Gospel of Mark are children that belong to both Mary and Joseph. So in the Gospel of Luke, there's no mention of Mary riding on a donkey. This changes things a little bit for our imagination. We might think about a woman who's approximately 8 months pregnant. She's making a pilgrimage from Galilee, once again, a 3 to 5 day journey, 60 to 80 miles in her third trimester, and she's walking on foot. And it's while they are there completing the census that Mary goes into labor. And we often have a lot of impressions of how this story plays out. And I want to kind of dig into this a little bit more deeply. One of the best known parts of the Christmas story is the fact that there was no room in the inn. And entire Christmas pageants and sermons have been based upon this idea of a grouchy innkeeper who says there's no room in the inn for you. And so he takes them around back to this stable where Mary gives birth to Jesus. But the problem with this portrayal is that we bring a lot of assumptions with us that just don't comport with the actual biblical text. The first thing that we need to know is that there's absolutely no archaeological evidence that a commercial inn existed in Bethlehem at the time of Jesus' birth. This was a tiny little village. Approximately 300 people lived there. There was no need for an inn. We also know that hospitality was one of the most important Jewish values. In fact, just last year, a group of West Virginians went on a trip to the Holy Land, and part of the time that they were there, they stayed in the homes of Jewish Christians because hospitality is such an important part of their culture of welcoming people into their homes. And so we might think about it, if we spend more time reflecting on this text, that if Mary and Joseph are making a pilgrimage back to Joseph's hometown, it wouldn't make sense for him to stay in a commercial inn anyways. He would stay with his parents, or he would stay with some other relatives. In fact, in Jewish culture, all you had to do is knock on someone's door and say, "Hi, I'm Joseph, I'm the son of so-and-so, and we need a place to stay." And that was enough in that place and time for Mary and Joseph to have a place to stay. We can also maybe infer that since Joseph is making this pilgrimage into town to complete the census, that some of his other relatives would have been too. And so that's why the house may have been so occupied. So aside from all of that, we need to know a little bit more about a first century Jewish home to really be able to make sense of this story. A first century Jewish home was essentially two different rooms. You had a guest room that, according to this diagram, did not have any kind of internal door to get to the other part of the house. It just has an external door. And so it makes me think of a guest house or a pool house. And then you have this family room. And the family room is where you would cook over here, maybe. I'm just guessing. You cook and you would eat over here, and you might sleep over here. All of these things would take place in the family room. And then you would also have access down these steps to get into the stable. And so the stable, as strange as it might seem for us, the stable wasn't really separate from the rest of the house. You see the mangers here, which would have either been built out of wooden boxes or hewn out of the limestone floor. And so you could have cattle kind of just popping their head over this ledge, eating from the manger. And you might be over here in this corner eating your dinner. And the cattle had external access, so they could come and go as they please. So when we have this understanding of a first century Jewish home, it makes so much more sense of the story. Now, the most important part for us is understanding this guest room, the katalume. There's only one other place in the New Testament that this word appears, and it is when Jesus and his disciples celebrate the Passover. We're told that they celebrate the Passover in the upper room, and it comes from the Greek word katalume. I think that what has happened is that this word katalume has been translated as in the King James Version, which is the version that we traditionally read during this time of the year. And more modern translations have been hesitant to update that because people sometimes get a little bit frustrated. I can't even really think of the right word. People get a little bit nervous when we start changing really traditional language. But there are some English translations that translate the word katalume, guest room, that there was no room for Mary and Joseph to stay in the guest room. And so we can take all of that information and conclude that there were so many people at this home, so many people staying in the guest room, that Mary and Joseph were staying in this space, that Mary gave birth here, and that because there was no room in the guest room, that she laid Jesus in a manger. And so ultimately, when we kind of step back for a moment, all of this is kind of interesting, but it doesn't ultimately change the story at all. It just helps us understand the finer points of what happened at Jesus' birth. got an external access. Now we turn to the birth story in the Gospel according to Matthew. Matthew's account is much shorter than the story we find in the Gospel of Luke. And the primary person of focus is Joseph. At the beginning, Mary tells Joseph that she's with child, and it seems that Joseph clearly does not believe her story. And Matthew tells us that Joseph is a righteous man, that he's going to divorce Mary quietly. And sometimes we assume that Joseph is righteous because he's going to do it quietly. But the majority of biblical scholars believe that Joseph is righteous because he's going to divorce Mary, because he's going to be a Torah observant Jew. It's unlikely at this point that Mary and Joseph have developed deep romantic feelings toward one another. After all, they are adolescents whose marriage has been prearranged by their family. Mary has lived with her father. They have had the engagement ceremony. They have this legally binding contract, but there's really no reason to believe that Mary and Joseph are deeply in love with one another. But even if they were, according to the law of Moses, it was Joseph's responsibility under these circumstances to divorce Mary. Now, according to the law of Moses, it was actually Joseph's responsibility to have Mary put to death. But because the Israelites were living under Roman occupation, they no longer had the authority to carry out capital punishment. If it was a situation where there was a murderer, then they would turn that individual over to the Roman government, and the Roman government would carry out capital punishment. The rationale was that if the Israelites tried to do it themselves, then it could turn into chaos and some kind of revolt, and the Romans just didn't want to take that kind of chance. But with something like committing adultery, the Romans saw that as weird. No other way to put it, that the Israelites would want to execute for someone for that reason. And so the equivalent of having someone put to death for adultery in the first century was to divorce them. So that's exactly what Joseph was going to do. He was going to divorce Mary. And what we can say about Joseph's character is that he was going to do it quietly. He had two options. He could take her to a public trial, and there would be a lot of advantages for Joseph for doing this. First of all, this was a culture of honor and shame, like we see in a lot of Eastern cultures, where if Joseph was somehow shamed through this experience, his entire family, his parents, and everyone from his little hub of life would be shamed as well. And so by taking Mary to a public trial and shaming her, this would vindicate Joseph and his family. It could also be financially advantageous for Joseph to do this because he's paid Mary's father a dowry. By doing it quietly, Joseph would take Mary before 2 or 3 witnesses. They would nullify their vows, and it would be over. Joseph could go on with his life and move on, and whatever happened with Mary, that was up to her. But before any of that could happen, an angel appeared to Joseph and kind of brought him up to speed. And from that point forward, Joseph just becomes this exemplary figure of someone who faithfully follows God even when it doesn't quite seem to add up and make sense. Joseph takes his responsibility as Jesus' adoptive father very seriously. It was the father's responsibility to name the child, and Matthew tells us that Joseph named his son Jesus, Yeshua, which was the Aramaic equivalent of the name Joshua. It means the Lord will save. So sometimes we think Jesus' name was quite unique, and it really wasn't. His name was Joshua. What makes his name unique is that he is Christ the Lord. So one other thing that might be helpful for us to think about Joseph's deep commitment is the fact that in the ancient world, The eldest son received half of the father's inheritance. We know that Mary and Joseph had 3 other sons. And so that means that when Joseph died, that Jesus would receive half of the inheritance, and the other 3 would have to split the other half. And part of the reason was it was the eldest son's responsibility to care for his mother until her death, and so it was kind of great responsibility comes with this gift. So Joseph takes this on without hesitation. He adopts Jesus as his son. And the story really doesn't say much about Jesus' birth. Nothing about Mary and Joseph making a pilgrimage to complete the census. In fact, in the Gospel according to Matthew, it is assumed that Mary and Joseph already live in Bethlehem, and they have a house there. Matthew doesn't give us great details, nothing about shepherds, nothing about Jesus being laid in a manger. Matthew seems to be much more interested in what happens after Jesus' birth. There is this group of men who come from the east. And we often assume that there were 3 of them because they brought 3 gifts. But it's more likely that there were lots and lots of these people. We call them sometimes wise men, sometimes kings, but their technical name was magi. And we think of magi as being representatives of a king. They were diplomats, and magi were people almost equivalent to a Hebrew prophet. They did study astronomy, so they looked at the stars, and the rising of a new star indicated the birth of a new king. And for some of us, this might just seem so incredibly far-fetched, but magi existed in the ancient world. They came out of Persia, and they did travel throughout the Eastern world, and they served diplomatic purposes. In the Gospel of Matthew, it says that when they arrived in Jerusalem, that there was a great uproar, which seems to suggest that there were definitely more than 3. They caused a scene. There were possibly hundreds of magi that came to seek out this newborn king. And of all places, they came to Jerusalem because that's the capital of Israel. And they find the king of the Jews, Herod, who tries to play it cool but doesn't do a very good job. The Magi want to know where the newborn king of the Jews is, and Herod is terrified because it's implied that the rise of a new king means the fall of the old king. And so Matthew tells us that Herod, along with all of Jerusalem, they were disturbed by this news. And this is hyperbolic. It's not that the people in Jerusalem loved Herod and were afraid that he would no longer be their king. It's actually quite the opposite. They knew that he was a volatile individual, that he would do anything to hold on to his power. In Josephus's account of Herod's reign as king, we find that he killed one of his wives, he killed 2 of his sons, and that whenever he was on his deathbed, he was ordering for some of the most noble people in Jerusalem to be executed so that there would be mourning at the time of his death. And after he had his wife killed, Herod believed that she haunted him in his castles. And so he was considered to be mad, to be crazy. And so there's no extra biblical record of Herod ordering for the Hebrew boys to be massacred. But historians completely agree that this comports with his character, that no one would put Herod past executing children because he was afraid of the threat that they would pose of becoming the next king. In fact, one of the rulers of the Roman Empire, who was friends with Herod, said that it was better to be Herod's pig than to be his son, because he was such a violent person that he would even kill his own children. So Herod is quite upset. He doesn't understand what's going on. He doesn't know anything about where the king of the Jews is supposed to be born, and so he gathers his wise men. He gathers the people in his court who know the Hebrew prophecies, and they explain that the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem. And of course, Herod wants to send these magi on their way, almost as spies. He wants them to pass along the word of what they find. And so the magi, they continue to follow the star of Bethlehem. They go to the place of Jesus' family home, and they bring gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And so Matthew wants us to know very clearly that Jesus is understood as the King of the Jews. It's believed that Matthew, the author of Matthew's Gospel, was a Jewish Christian who's writing to other Jewish Christians and wants to provide solid evidence that Jesus is the Messiah whom they have been waiting for. And so this story tells us that Jesus is the newborn King of the Jews. And according to Matthew, the Magi do not go back to Herod. They do not report what they have seen. Instead, they go home a different way. And this text is often preached on the Sunday of Epiphany because the Gentiles, the Magi were Gentiles. They were people who lived outside of Israel, and their eyes were opened. They recognized who Jesus was, and it says that they bow before him, and it's possible that they're just going through the customary practices of bowing before royalty, but we as Christians understand it maybe as an act of worship. And this whole concept of them going home a different way has often been taken as a way to express that they've had some kind of revelatory experience. They go home a different way, or they go home a different kind of people than they were before, that their lives have somehow been transformed by this encounter with Jesus the Christ. And so just like Luke's gospel is not intended to report cut and dried historical information, neither is Matthew's. Matthew tells us that after all of this, that Joseph took his family to Egypt, and they stayed there for an indefinite period of time. And after Herod's death, they came back, and they did not resettle in Bethlehem, where they had originally lived. Instead, they live in northern Israel, in Galilee, in this little town of Nazareth. And so when we try to smash Luke and Matthew together into one account, we really mess them up, because they're probably communicating some kind of deeper theological message than trying to report cold, hard facts about history. And when we try to harmonize them, when we try to reconcile the differences, we often muffle the significant signs and symbols that are at the heart of the story. I know that the season of Advent is upon us, and I hope that this lesson will inspire you to dig deeper into these two passages in the New Testament, and to look more closely at the message and the meaning of Jesus' birth. Until next time, take care, and God bless.